Hardlines of History, a podcast connecting the past to the present. And today we're going to talk about Chinese and American relations and how they evolved under Nixon in his famous visit in 1971 in rapprochement. So, Jay, can you go ahead and start telling us a little bit about our key takeaways and what we're going to talk about today?
We are continuing our series on U.S.-Chinese relation, and we are finally at the U.S.-Chinese rapprochement during the Nixon administration in 1972. During the Cultural Revolution. So our last episode, we talked about the Cultural Revolution. We kind of made it up until this point, the early 70s. And now we're going to talk about, okay, in the middle of this chaos that was the Cultural Revolution in China, you also have a fairly topsy-turvy situation going on in the United States. The 60s was a wild time. For those of you that were alive and remember it,
kind of our own cultural revolution, maybe not quite as violent, but there's some levels of violence, not quite as chaotic as the Chinese, but it was a cultural revolution.
That's right. Significantly less people died. But, race relations, there was hippie culture, protests about Vietnam, etc. And Nixon was very much elected by the American people out of a large sense that the Democratic Party had allowed the craziness of the 60s to take place. JFK was the first president in the early 60s, and then Lyndon B. Johnson, LBJ, was the next one, and Nixon was elected in the election of 68, I believe. So Nixon gets inaugurated in January of 69, largely on a platform of we're going to withdraw from Vietnam responsibly, his Peace with Honor campaign, and we're also going to kind of chill out at home. We're going to try to fix things. So that's kind of the internal dynamics. So our key takeaways for this episode are really, we already kind of talked about the first two. So the first one being Mao's Cultural Revolution completely isolated China. They didn't even have diplomats in most of other countries. The CCP Foreign Affairs Office was pretty JV, junior varsity, by the CCP's own admission. Zhou Enlai was like, if you want to scare it, he said, this is the Jay paraphrase version, but he said, if you want to scare a Chinese diplomat, approach them and talk diplomacy. So CCP is kind of in a bad spot. Key takeaway number two, the Nixon administration needs a win. The U.S. really wants a win. There's a lot of fears in the Cold War. There's fears about nuclear war with Russia. There's fears of conflict with China over Taiwan. Vietnam's poor. The Nixon administration really needed a win. Key takeaway number three, this led to Richard Nixon making some pretty explicit overtures to the Chinese government in saying, I want to visit. It wasn't this broad, hey, we need to get back on the right track here. It was specifically, I want to visit your country, like invite me to come visit your country. And then lastly, key takeaway number four, the outcome of that visit was a document known as the Shanghai Communique or Communique, or you want to pronounce it. And that document wasn't really like a solid, significant changes. Rather, it was just like a statement of, hey, we are acknowledging what our issues are between our two countries. We're acknowledging our agreements. We're acknowledging our differences, and we are committing to a future conversation. So nothing solid was changed. Rather, it was just an agreement on what the status quo was. And then in future episodes, we'll kind of take it away and see what happens later. But that's largely what we're going to talk about in this episode.
So, Jay, thank you for those key takeaways. Can you tell us a little bit about how this meeting came to occur?
Yeah, for sure. So, yeah, just to tell the story a little bit on how this meeting occurred, because at the time, it was seen as kind of crazy. So one thing about Nixon, So Nixon is almost exclusively known in the United States for being a weirdo, primarily because of the Watergate scandal. Now, the Watergate scandal happened, or sorry, began to happen almost immediately after this visit. I believe towards the tail end of 72 was when it did happen because and Colin, feel free to fact check me on that one. But was it so? There was an election in there was an election in 72. So Nixon was
Yep.
elected in 68. There was an election in a general election in 72, and Watergate was basically the Nixon administration was spying on the Democratic National Convention. There was like some stuff getting stolen out of the Watergate Hotel, hence the Watergate
It was very
scandal.
interesting the phone line that they chose to tap, and what there's a lot. Watergate would almost be a great little mini series by itself, but without getting too into that, it's
Right.
interesting too because that general election, Nixon won in a landslide. I think it was
You're
one of the
talking about
largest in
in
'72.
68? Oh, in
No,
72.
72. Yeah, 72.
Oh,
Nixon
right.
won by a landslide. So he was very popular as a
Yeah.
president. It kind of begs the question of like, why bother spying on your political opposition when you so clearly have an advantage? But Watergate is that's another topic.
Yeah.
A lot of interesting conspiracy theories around it.
Yeah. And Nixon, honestly, is one of the more fascinating presidents of the 20th century. And he was a little weird. And the reason why like American high school history textbooks make Nixon out to be a weirdo was because like he had this aspect of paranoia and like extreme insecurity, which is kind of how people put Watergate through the lens of Nixon's paranoia about how he recorded his own meetings, and they kind of tie that into like Nixon. So Nixon had a similar instance. There's a photo of God, Colin, former mayor of New York, Republican Rudy Giuliani. There's a photo of Rudy Giuliani like standing at a press conference, sweating, and his hair dye is running down his face. You know what picture I'm talking about? There's like this black
Oh, are you talking?
liquid.
It's his hair gel for like all five hairs that he still had on top of his head. Yes.
Right. And he's this old guy that just doesn't present well on camera anymore. Like he's way past his prime, doesn't look good on camera. It just looks super embarrassing because he was, especially at the time, to the liberal media, he was trying to defend Trump and these election claims at the time. Regardless of whether or not you agree or disagree with the man, the photo is like, or photos of that press conference are unflattering to say the least.
Quick sidebar on Nixon. That's why he lost to Kennedy. Were you
No,
about to
that's
go
not a
there?
sidebar. That's exactly where I was going. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah,
Well,
that's
go
exactly
ahead.
where I was going. Yeah.
Carry on.
No, you're right. So Nixon was also this like old dude that did not present well on camera. And like, Colin, what you were saying about like a lot of people who watched the debate between him and JFK, Nixon lost because Nixon looked terrible on camera. He's like sweating profusely, just looked nervous, like this twitchy old man. Whereas JFK is young, put together, confident, knows what he wants to say, etc. Even though to the people listening to the debate on the radio thought Nixon actually had better points. And this kind of goes to why I was saying Nixon is a fascinating guy because he was really smart and he actually had like a really solid outlook on policy, both domestic and foreign policy. I don't want to say he was brilliant because I don't think he was like, this phenomenon, but at the same time, like he knew what he was doing. He wasn't an idiot. Like he was a successful politician for a reason.
He was extremely paranoid too, which I think that kind of gave way to Watergate. He was very paranoid, but he is a smart guy. You're right. He's not like some once in a generation like intellectual, but he went to Duke. He was a smart guy. He had some weird quirks and he was paranoid, but I think one of the things that he tried to do with his strategy was always play the long game. And I
Yeah.
think that's kind of why he and Kissinger orchestrated this meeting and this attempt. It's kind of an interesting story. Can you dive into like actually how they set
Yeah.
that up? Because from what I understand, the U.S. and China relations were closed for like 15 years because like we haven't. I think the last official
Yeah, I think it was
diplomatic
20 actually.
54. My math is when after Korea they met in Geneva, and I think
Oh, yeah, yeah, yeah.
the ambassador from the U.S. under Eisenhower refused to shake Zhao Enlai's hand. So like
Yeah.
since that moment, like diplomatic ties were
Was it Dulles? Yeah.
yeah, well, they were severed.
I
So
think it
for
was
like
John
50,
Foster Dulles.
yeah, yeah, they were completely severed, and like the Chinese took that like very personally. Um,
Yeah. So
so
Zhou
anyway,
Enlai in particular, I believe it was Zhou Enlai who got shunned by John Foster Dulles. He like held out his hand and John Foster Dulles like just walked past him. And so it's funny you bring that up because Zhou Enlai and Kissinger were very conscious to that slight by Dulles in the Eisenhower administration. And that there's a funny short story about that here in a second. So when Nixon gets elected, his like whole posture is we need a foreign policy win. We need something other than just the daily bad news that we're getting out of Vietnam. Uh, and we need a win. And so almost immediately he starts laying the groundwork to begin getting on a better footing with China. And he starts making some like fairly, in hindsight, fairly obvious overtures. But there's one key aspect about Nixon that nobody thought Nixon would be the guy that does this. And that is Nixon was an ardent anti-communist. Nixon was known for being extremely hawkish towards the Soviet Union and just on communism on the whole. Nixon, I believe, is Eisenhower's vice president, like went and visited Budapest. He and so Budapest was essentially run by the communists after World War II when the Soviet Union took over much of Eastern Europe, Central and Eastern Europe. Uh, Point being, Nixon was like very hawkish towards the communists. So nobody in a million years thought that Nixon was going to be like, hey, let's become friendly with a major communist country, which was China. So much so that when the Nixon administration began these overtures, they kept it extremely secret. So enter Henry Kissinger. So both Nixon and Kissinger were extremely skeptical and suspicious of the State Department at this time. You know, the 1960s, 1970s is not that far removed from the Red Scare. It's in the middle of the Cold War. If our listeners, can recall our earlier episodes about HUAC, the House Un-American Activities Committee, or Senator Joseph McCarthy and McCarthyism. Like, if you're a Republican, like your arch enemy is commies, right? Like, so much so that when I was growing up, like if you wanted to insult somebody, you called him a commie, right?
God, how old are you?
Yeah. Old enough to know what I'm talking about.
Well, yeah, no, I think you're right about the going back to the win. If you think about it, for an American, we were losing Vietnam. Well, yeah, we were trying to get out of Vietnam. We were trying to get out. Things
We
were
were
not going
losing
well.
Vietnam. We were
Yeah,
not winning in Vietnam.
it's still a tough pill to swallow.
Yeah, we lost in Vietnam, folks.
Yeah, and Nixon's
That's Jay's
message
opinion.
was, well, we did. There's now one Vietnam and it's communist, but his message was peace with honor. He was trying to withdraw.
Right.
Nixon was trying to establish through these backdoor channels, like you're saying, by making overtures. Was Mao doing the same thing? Was he trying to
No.
invite the U.S. in? Okay.
No. So this is kind of where this gets interesting. So because Nixon and Kissinger didn't trust the State Department, because a lot of people blamed the State Department for, being communist sympathizers, etc., Nixon and Kissinger kind of tried to establish these secret ties directly with the CCP. And it very much in the beginning was a one-way street. So if we talked about the US PRC ambassadorial talks, that was the US ambassador to Poland and the communist Chinese ambassador to Poland would meet in this like mansion somewhere near Warsaw, and they would have these talks. that was because Poland was a communist country at the time, and they were cool with hosting these things. And they were also, and the Soviet Union was also cool with bugging this mansion. And the US knew it, and we would actually try to message the Soviets through these ambassadorial talks with the Chinese. However, when these talks ended up breaking down, were canceled. So when the Nixon administration tried to use them to reach out and say, hey, Nixon wants to visit China, it ended up not working out. So that was the first unsuccessful attempt. Secondly, Kissinger had a relationship with the new US ambassador to Pakistan. So, and because things were kept super secret, Kissinger sent this guy a letter and was like, for your eyes only, meet me in California at this like restaurant or hotel next week. End of letter. Signed, National Security Advisor Henry Kissinger. And allegedly this ambassador was like, Henry, what the frick are you talking about? And so he flies from Pakistan to this place in California, meets Henry Kissinger, like sits down, and he's like, Henry, I just flew halfway across the country, and I don't know why I'm here.
Across the world.
Across the world. And I don't know why I'm here. And Kissinger was just like, I want you to get me in contact with the Chinese through the Pakistanis. And he's like, what the heck are you talking about? And it was so absurd at this time because literally nobody thought the Nixon administration was going to try to make contact and improve the situation with the Chinese. So long story short, through the Pakistanis, who had a good relationship with the Chinese because of their mutual enemy, India. That's why China and Pakistan have always been buddy-buddy, because they both don't like India. Whereas the US has always had an interesting relationship with Pakistan. At the time, it was good. They arrange for Kissinger to make this secret trip over to China. In 1970, Kissinger was on like this Pacific tour, and then he feigned getting sick one day. So he was in Pakistan and he got sick. If anyone's ever heard of the Delhi belly, that's what they said Kissinger had. It was just an upset stomach due to eating Indian food. When in fact he didn't. And he made a secret flight from, I believe, Karachi to Beijing, and was met by none other than Zhou Enlai at the airport. So here's the funny story about the handshake. When Kissinger gets off the plane, he gets escorted to Beijing. Zhou Enlai doesn't even get out of the car. Zhou Enlai's like car comes up. He's like so excited to meet Kissinger that he rolls down the window, sticks his hand out to Kissinger, and Kissinger realizing what he knows what's going on. Kissinger was and is brilliant, by the way. He's still alive, but he knows what's going on. And he goes up, walks up to the car window and shakes Zhou Enlai's hand. And that's kind of like the beginning of, hey, this is a different administration. We're here on good terms. Kissinger just spends the day with Zhou Enlai, communicates, hey, we want Nixon. We want you guys to invite Nixon. It can't be Nixon's coming to perform the kowtow to the emperor type deal. It's you guys have to invite us. They agree on that, so on and so forth. So they arrange, I believe Kissinger makes one more visit, all kept secret from the press. There's actually some fascinating details that we don't have time to get into here of the Kissinger and the Nixon administration like going through some pretty large steps to keep all this secret from both the press and the State Department. So yeah, he comes back. They make these arrangements, and in February of 1972, Nixon goes and visits Mao in the CCP in Beijing.
So before we go much further, because I think Nixon's, when he gets off the plane and starts talking, it's pretty interesting. But before, I do want to give a quick overview of what's happening in China at this point. So we left off last week with Liu Shaoqi, Deng Xiaoping, most of the CCP leadership being condemned and purged, mostly under the obviously given the okay by Mao, but Kang Shang was the architect behind this condemnation that was directed at Liu Shaoqi and these other members of the CCP in order to purge them from the party. They had fallen out of favor with Mao. They were accused of being rightists, revisionists, the worst possible thing you could be called in the early parts of the Cultural Revolution. So they were purged from the party. They were removed. Some were sent to exile. Some were put on house arrest. Some committed suicide. The Red Guards were essentially disbanded by being sent to the countryside. So no longer did you have these young students and youth members of the Red Guards implementing this Cultural Revolution. Now, Mao was able to use the military under Lin Biao. And I actually was going over the Wade Giles romanization, kind of this transliteration between English and Mandarin. And it's also can be pronounced Lin Piao. So if I get it wrong or you've heard both, I'm talking about the same guy. So
I think the P is like more traditional, whereas if you like go for the B, that's more like modern Chinese. Like the communists prefer the B and Taiwan prefers the P.
oof.
This is this is so strange, but like Beijing, that pronunciation is like an intentional communist, like we pronounce it Beijing, whereas the PRC and the KMT pronounce it Beiping.
I don't want to
Fun
cause
fact.
an international incident on the podcast with choosing Taiwan or China, because that might actually happen soon in the podcast, and we'll get there.
Dun, dun.
But under the Ninth Party Congress, the last one we talked about was the Eighth, and that was where they removed Mao thought. It was after Khrushchev's secret speech. The party kind of got really weary of Mao and Mao thought. They reinstate Mao Zedong thought. It's now Marxist-Leninist Mao thought that's being put back. And at this Congress, Lin Piao is named the successor to Mao. He was the Secretary of Defense or Minister of Defense, Secretary of Defense. He was in charge of the army. If you remember, he was the one that was in charge of responsible for bringing the Little Red Book, implementing it in the military, making it required reading and training material that infiltrated into the rest of society. So he is a hardline communist and very aligned with Mao. In 1968 and 69, if you remember a few episodes ago, we talked about this border dispute with the Soviets on the island of Damsky. Am I pronouncing that right?
Sure, I don't know.
Where the Chinese and
the mud flat in the middle of the river. That's what I remember.
Yes, that's exactly what it is. And it had actually been a scene where like they would almost kind of like just fight each other, but not actually shoot, kind of like the Indian and Chinese border right now. But they start shooting at each other. It causes an incident, an international incident, almost leads to a nuclear war, because then the Soviets ended up retaliating on the western border of China and like totally wiped out a Chinese squadron. And then they were testing nukes like not far away from China's border. So Mao saw this and he was really worried. And because Lin Biao was now the successor to Mao, he had a lot of influence in the military, and they came in and just declared martial law over the country to regain control. So the party is being purged. The country is now under revolution and fully embracing Mao Zedong thought. So they declare martial law, they take over the country, and they view this right now. And Mao, Lin, the rest of the CCP, Zhou Enlai, I think it was Michael Pillsbury that talked about this old Chinese quote where it's wise to sit on a mountain and watch two tigers fight. Mao kind of viewed the Soviets as an enemy and the Americans as an enemy, and they were sort of caught in the middle. So much like Kissinger was going to look at the long game and see like, how do we counter the Russians? The Chinese were like, how do we counter the Russians? Well, maybe we can get the Americans to play off of them. Maybe we can become friends with them, because we've got the Indians to the south. We've got the Taiwanese across the strait. We've got the Soviets to the north. And I think it was Zhou Enlai who advised Mao to stop fighting with the Soviets, because I think he knew at the time the Soviets had a much stronger military at the time, and they were in a precarious position with the Cultural Revolution. So I just want to bring that up to say, like, okay, this is what's going through Mao's thought right now. It's martial law. They are very close to nuclear war with the Soviets. Things are not good between the two, and they're in a bad spot through international politics and relations. So that's kind of fueling their move to accept the U.S. overtures and their attempts at diplomatic relations.
Right. No, and that's great because at the moment of when Nixon visits China, it's good to think about like, okay, who needed who more, right? I've heard a very interesting definition of leverage as you have leverage if you don't need the agreement more than what your interlocutor or your negotiation partner, if they need the agreement more than you do, you have leverage over them. Oh, I thought that was an interesting definition of leverage because I traditionally think of leverage as, oh, I have something over you, when in fact, leverage is, I don't need this as much as you do, if that makes any sense. So I bring that up. Sorry, go ahead. Go ahead, Colin.
No, I was going to say that's a great definition, and that it kind of sums it up perfectly right here.
Yeah. So it's interesting to think about this meeting in light of that definition of leverage, because if you think about it, economically speaking, militarily speaking, diplomatically speaking, like all of these different things, even though the US is mired in a complete and utter debacle in Vietnam, the US still is the number one economy in the world. We're still technologically like light years ahead of the Chinese at this point. We like NATO is robust and thriving more or less at this time. Like the United States is the most diplomatically like connected country in the world. Like
And this is at our low point, by the way, at a kind of a
yeah,
low
yeah,
point.
like yeah, like we in America, like Americans look back on this time and go like, oh man, that sucked. When like, but relative to like the rest of the world, we're still like the clear superpower. Uh, the Soviet Union is number two, and it's a distant number two if you were to rank it across like those metrics, right? So, but yet Nixon is the one that is more or less acting desperate to get a meeting with the Chinese. And if you look at the Chinese perspective, they're in the middle of the Cultural Revolution. It's chaos in their country. Economically speaking, they're in a bad spot. Diplomatically speaking, they're in a horrible spot. Militarily speaking, like, yeah, they have a lot of people, but the PLA is still light years behind the United States, at least.
Yeah, and that's why I brought up one of their whole squadrons just being annihilated in Western China, because I think the Soviets went with like a company of infantry with a couple tanks and like two helicopters and just wiped out the Chinese. And that was kind
Yeah.
of and that was where Mao was like, "Oh,
Wait a minute.
we do not need to get in a conflict with the Russians," because he looked at his, there's the Great Wall, but like there's a huge border between China at the time. There's obviously Mongolia right there, but there's this massive expanse of Western China that is very difficult to defend, and it would be
Yeah.
tough to defend against the Soviets. And that's what he saw. He's like, "Whoops,
Right.
don't go to
Well,
war with the Soviets yet. The PLA is not ready."
yeah. Well, this just goes to show like one of China's strengths is they are probably, and I mean culturally speaking, the best in the world at deception, at misleading people as to the true nature of what's actually going on. Was it Sun Tzu that said, like, when you're weak, appear strong, and when you're strong, appear weak? Like, they have mastered the art of appearing as the exact opposite of what's going on. And that's what happens when Nixon meets Mao in Beijing. Like it's utter chaos in their country, and they completely fooled the United States in thinking they were 10 feet tall.
So, with that being said, can you talk about how Kissinger has just made this secret meeting under the auspices of having the deli belly and food poisoning?
Yeah.
Now, what happened when Nixon arrived in China?
Yeah. So in February 1972, Nixon shows up in China. And I really want to put it in the light of what it was, and that is a PR event. And I don't say that necessarily to downplay its significance, rather, but just to accurately characterize what it was. Because when Nixon flew to Beijing, he took like two commercial airplanes full of reporters, and everything was staged. We talk about China and its communist China in particular and its ability to like stage these events. Like if anybody's seen party congresses, the last one was in October of last year, and it's this extremely scripted, extremely event or extremely staged event.
The
And I don't
2008
mean that
Olympic opening show was probably more of a pop
amazing.
culture. Yeah, it was a pop culture PR event, but that's kind of what they were doing.
Yes.
The world was their stage, and they knew everybody would be watching.
And they are really freaking good at staging these like huge things. Like, but yeah, when in 70 excuse me, in 72 when Nixon goes to China, it's like the US was in equal measure trying to stage everything. So like, it's pretty common that when the president travels like weeks in advance, if not months in advance, there will be people like doing logistics, setting up communications, like doing security, etc., showing up. And that was very true here, like weeks prior to. There's some funny anecdotes that we just don't have time to get into about, the US is more accustomed to a certain level of technology, like the forklift. And when these logistics folks were showing up ahead of Nixon's event, they were like, "Hey, do you guys have any forklifts to move like heavy equipment?" And the Chinese people are like, "What's a forklift?"
Just send 100 people to go pick it up.
Yeah, like it was just like the US showed up in force, staging all this stuff. All the major cable networks arrived in advance. A young Barbara Walters was pissed that she got put on the jet that Nixon and the bigwigs, like the big White House folks, were not on. She was apparently, it was called, I'm forgetting the exact name. Like apparently the jet with which was filled with nothing but orders. It was called like the animal train or like the animal cart or something like that. Like apparently it was just like chaos with all these like random reporters. A young Barbara Walters got put on that one. She was a part of this visit. Uh,
You're talking about it kind of being like the US. Like, here's the level of detail that the US, like, we got down to with this, because there's, we always have these moments that are captured, and they're like, we got to capture this moment right here. This is the PR event. So, like, when Nixon got off the plane with his wife, Thelma Catherine Nixon, also known as Pat, she was wearing like a red dress because they knew like the color red was going to be very significant for the Chinese. And like the handshake between like, so you had, Nixon coming down Air Force One with Pat in red. She was wearing red very deliberately, getting off the plane. And like when it was Zhao and Lai standing there for the handshake, because like that moment was incredibly significant, showing like the US president is like shaking hands with a guy that they blew off, like almost 20 years prior. So like, just to your point, like this was a spectacle of PR, and they captured it down to the details of what color people were going to wear.
yeah. And it's funny. So like the the US press was like in force. They showed up. What's funny is the Chinese press. So the major Chinese newspaper is at the time was called the People's Daily. The People's Daily is still a newspaper in China. It's still probably the main government arm, but there is some other news
I've
outlets.
cited it a few times throughout here, but yes, it
Yeah.
is a great resource to find out what was going on in the 50s and 60s in China.
So the People's Daily didn't even cover the fact that Nixon was coming until the day that he came, and they were just kind of like, "Meh, he's here." So like they were there, they were covering the event. As a matter of fact, like it wasn't even front page news, and it was kind of seen as intentional. They wanted to make sure that literally the exact opposite of kind of Nixon's posture, like he wanted it to be a PR win. Mao was cognizant to the fact that it was like, "Oh, we need to make sure that it's not seen as like we're bowing down to the capitalists and the rightists," which was a criticism that he faced by none other than Lin Biao, his new deputy, who would later die. Go figure. But yeah, mysteriously being shot down. I mean, crashed in a plane over Mongolia. Nevertheless, you had two different postures. The CCP was trying to downplay Nixon's visit, whereas Nixon in the American press was like, pictures, cameras flying off, blah blah blah. long story short, just for the sake of time, Nixon spends a week. He visits the Great Wall. He hangs out in the Forbidden City, and there's a couple meetings. There's this like big banquet on day one when Nixon comes to visit. Won't go into too much detail on the details of the visit, but essentially Nixon fancies himself as a foreign policy guy. Everybody kind of has their strengths and weaknesses when it comes to policy. And Nixon believed he was a foreign policy guy as opposed to being a domestic policy guy. So when he meets with Chairman Mao for the first time, he's like very direct and wants to talk about substantive issues. And in that first meeting, Mao is just kind of like, eh, we'll leave the diplomats to have these conversations. Like, what do you think about our tea? And so Nixon was like slightly frustrated, but because, again, going back to leverage here, he felt his perception was that he needed this to be a good visit. He was not going to press Mao and make it a confrontational visit, whereas Mao had all the leverage, this perceived leverage over Nixon, because Mao was like, I don't need this. Like a master at the bluff, where like in reality, he was scared to death about nuclear war with the Soviets. And this dude had the wherewithal to, when literally the president of the superpower of the world shows up, he just kind of not blows him off, but just kind of masterfully goes like, these issues, they're kind of whatever.
I've said it once and I'll say it again. Mao, he's a lot of things, but he is a political machine. He's deft, he's subtle, he's very good at politics,
Right.
which it makes sense. He's been through a lot. Just looking over his life, he's been through quite a bit. But anyway, so what was the result of this visit?
Yeah, so, and that's a great segue, because I kind of bring up this point over and over again about Nixon being the needy one on the side of the relationship, because this whole visit results in a document called the Shanghai Communique or Communique. And this is the first of what's called the 3 joint communiques, which are very important documents that basically define the current 2023 U.S.-Chinese relationship. The first one was signed in 1972 at the end of this one. There are other 2 that we'll get into in future episodes, but the second one was signed. The second one was signed in 1979 in the Carter administration. I want to say the third one was also signed by the Carter administration, but I'm not sure. It's shortly thereafter, so Colin, feel free to fact check me there. Nevertheless, this first one, essentially, it didn't change the status quo. Rather, it was just a document.
It was 82, by the way. Sorry.
82.
I did come off mute. Yeah,
Reagan
it was 82.
Administration.
Yeah.
Thank you.
It was probably the least significant. It just reaffirmed the other 2, basically. And they're current.
Gotcha.
It was probably less significant. We'll get there when we get there. We'll get there when we get there.
That's right. So this first one, it simply stated areas of agreement and areas for future discussion, i.e. disagreement. And the key phrase that comes out of this is that the U.S. acknowledges that both sides of the Taiwan Strait believe there is one China. And what that phrase means is the U.S. is not picking sides on who the rightful government of China, capital C China, is. But it's acknowledging both the CCP and the KMT at the time position that there's one China. And we see here in the beginnings of what's known as the one China policy. Now, this document didn't agree to it. That actually comes in the 1979, the second joint communique, the actual affirmation of the one China policy. But here's where the groundwork gets laid, and it's just an acknowledgement as opposed to an agreement or acceptance. Sorry.
It's still the wording of that is incredibly subtle, because the U.S. was able to not take sides, but at the same time acknowledge that there is one China. I think Westerners kind of underestimate that and the significance of the wording and how carefully they had to toe the line to make both sides happy, because at the time they were, previous to that, they were absolutely going to support Taiwan. But the Taiwanese viewed this as an utter betrayal because they understood what it meant for them. They meant that the U.S. was not going to defend them the way that they had during the
That's
Taiwan
right.
Straits incidents. And I think there was someone that asked Nixon, and I don't know if it was a reporter or just somebody in passing, asked if he had a message for Chiang Kai-shek, and he just said, "I wish him health and wellness." Basically, he said, "Hey, I wish him, I wish
Mhm.
him well. I wish him health." That's all he said, and that was a very politically coded message that's saying, like, I'm going to remain neutral. I hope you
Yeah.
can. Yeah. Anyway, very tricky situation.
No, Cheng in February, when Nixon was, in Beijing, Chiang Kai-shek made a speech in Taiwan and basically, like, condemned the visit. He was not happy and basically said, like, "This does not go towards furthering the cause of peace in the world," uh, which was the framing of the Nixon administration for the visit. It was advancing peace in the world, similar to his Vietnam policy, which was peace with honor, right? I.e., let's get out of Vietnam the right way, etc. So Chiang Kai-shek is saying the exact opposite. This is not going to bring peace in the world.
Do you think that Nixon should have visited China? And did the U.S. actually benefit from this visit?
Yeah, you're right. That was a good segue into what, like, was this a good idea? And so so I'm gonna give what sounds like a cop out, but it's not, and hear me out. At the time, it was a good idea, right? It's only in hindsight in 2023, now that we can see how things have played out, that it's like, okay, maybe this wasn't the right idea. But at the time, we couldn't have known that a man named Xi Jinping was going to come into power and completely, like, be aggressive, kind of like a radical Mao, right?
Yeah, I think so. It's a complicated question to ask. And looking at the cost benefit, yes, 50 years later, we look back and we're like, well, the Chinese were just trying to screw us the whole time. They were trying to take our stuff. Yes, and like Michael Pillsbury, he's written a couple books on it. He even calls himself like incredibly deceived. But like, and I have a very specific idea of foreign policy. I actually think at the time, if taken in a vacuum, this one visit and Nixon's idea was correct. We needed to go to China because at the time, the bigger threat to the US was the Soviets. Building bridges to the Chinese diplomatically was actually probably more advantageous for us even than the Chinese, because it's not like we became best buds with the Chinese and we're allies. It was simply that, okay, we have more favorable terms, we're likely not to fight each other again, so we're kind of all playing each other off one another. I think it was necessary and it had a net benefit. However, it was the follow-on execution or of those diplomatic ties. The other communiques, the other presidents that followed were kind of swindled under the idea that, yeah, we just built a bridge. We built this diplomatic bridge. We're okay. We can trust one another. When in reality, Mao was drawing the US in close, basically to use us to gain strength. Like you said earlier, appear weak when you're strong or appear strong when you're weak. He was just pulling us in because he knew we were weak and he needed to gain a lot from the United States while giving as little as he possibly could. So, what I mean by when I say like it was poorly executed after Nixon, the trade agreements, which I railed on, I think during the history of the U.S. economy or capitalism, socialism, U.S. We got into bad trade policies. That was obviously a key point for the Trump administration was these really bad trade policies. Military secrets have been stolen. Billions of dollars worth of intellectual property has been stolen. It has not panned out the way. And I think if you're going to have a relationship like this, you have to constantly have president administrations that are willing to continue to be very diligent of their relationship with China, knowing that they're going to try and use us for all. If you just go in with awareness that they're going to try and use you for everything that they can get out of you, you can probably safeguard yourself a little bit better. But I don't think the US did. I don't think the US, to be completely honest, this is not necessarily like an endorsement of Trump at all, but it's really like, hey, he was the first president that kind of woke up to the fact that, hey, maybe we've been kind of taken advantage of. And he just said out loud what a lot of people were already thinking and beginning to
That's right.
realize.
So
Anyway,
no, it's funny.
my
It's funny you
diatribe.
mention that because I quick disclaimer. And it actually goes to like prove the point that I'm trying to make here. And that is what I'm about to say is nothing about taking cheap shots at either the Trump or the Biden administration. Rather, it's about what's good policy, right? So I agree with you that the Trump administration was doing the right thing in trying to correct the trade imbalance in in our relationship with China today, because it's very much it's unbalanced. Like China doesn't have we do not have a fair trade relationship. Even after the Trump tariffs, we still don't have a quote unquote fair trade relationship with China. And it goes towards kind of the whole posture, like going back to leverage and Nixon's visit here, was that we clearly communicated to China the United States wants the relationship more than they do. And China has been more than happy over the last nearly 50 years exploiting that. Now, what's funny is that when Trump was increasing these tariffs and doing all this stuff, the media, by and large, flipped out and started talking about trade wars, etc. Look, folks, I'm being 100% honest. I am not a fan of the person of Donald J. Trump. All right. So, like, I feel no emotional compulsion to try to defend him whatsoever. I'm truly only talking about the policies here. And the media flipped out, causing he's going to cause a trade war. Everything's horrible. And you know what's funny? You know why we don't hear about the trade war anymore? Because the Biden administration hasn't changed a single tariff, not one. They have kept all of the Trump administration era tariffs. Now, this is why I threw that disclaimer out there. So one might interpret that and say, like, the Biden administration's a bunch of hypocrites, blah, 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 blah. To which I would say, it's not the Biden administration. The Biden administration is doing the right thing. It's good. We should applaud the Biden administration for continuing these tariffs. The hypocrites is the media. Now, I'm sure there's somewhat of a reciprocal relationship between the administration and the media. But nevertheless, the point I'm trying to make here is it's good. Those tariffs, it's good on the Trump administration and good on the Biden administration for trying to fix this one-sided relationship that we've had with China since Nixon showed up in 72.
Yeah, and I think that kind of goes back to like asking a question of like, well, did the CCP have good intentions behind these meetings and did they want to improve relations? It's kind of like no, not really, because like, yes, they wanted to improve relations, but why? Well, it was everybody is a self-interested actor, like politically speaking. Like you're always going to try and do what's absolutely best for you. You're going to try and gain the maximum value out of any relationship. That applies to different countries and their diplomats. Like the CCP and Mao specifically, we're looking at it like, okay, we're in a tight spot. What do? We can leverage the Americans. We can take from them. We can take advantage of this relationship. And he's like, I think we can do it. And we're probably a lot better at it than they are. So they absolutely had every intention of I'll use the term exploiting the relationship through trade, because if you remember from the Great Leap Forward, they're like 1 year their GDP dropped like 30%. I think in 66 from the Red Guards and the Cultural Revolution, it dropped 12%. So like their economy was not what it is today by any stretch of the imagination. They had barely industrialized, if you even want to call it that. So they were like, well, we can use the economic wealth and investment of the United States to fuel our economy, which is ironic because they're communist and they're going to use the rightist country of the United States. But it's what they did. They infused the US capital and investment to sustain their country.
Yeah, it's From the US perspective, we have always valued the US Chinese relationship for the relationship's own sake. It's kind of this philosophical American cultural position that in order to have peace in the world, you need to have positive relations with as many people as possible, right? China, on the other hand, doesn't view it that way. They don't give a flying rip about the relationship for the relationship's own sake. And they were actually very clear about that when Nixon went to visit China. And they've been very clear about it since then. Their number one issue is the reunification of China, and that includes Taiwan. So when Kissinger showed up in 71 and started talking with Zhou Enlai was like, Taiwan, dude, that is our number one thing. So they have approached in the 70s and today, they approach the US relationship only as a means to an end, whereas the United States approaches it as an end into itself, and then the benefits from the end are just icing on top, like the economic stuff, etc. It's We're not trying to get the Chinese to do anything other than lay the groundwork for undefined positive stuff. Whereas on the Chinese side, it is we intentionally want to have good relationship with the United States because we don't want them to interfere when we try to forcefully or not forcefully, but just nevertheless try to reunify the country.
That's such a good way to put it because the Chinese they have clear, tangible goals that they want to get out of the relationship. The
Right.
U.S. doesn't really.
We don't.
Well, we just want the relationship for the sake of itself.
That's
What
right.
does that even mean? Define that. And it kind of goes back to, and people don't really want to hear this, but the Chinese think and approach the world very differently than we do. Like, not everyone thinks like Americans. Not everyone. It's like we're kids on a playground that we just want to be liked by everybody. Like, and the Chinese don't. They're perfectly content to not do that. And I think if we look at it like, hey, how do we improve relations today? It's like, well, this is my opinion, understanding that the Chinese right now have the leverage because it appears that we need them more than they need us. And we act like that. To be honest, just we don't need them. You're right. Like, what goal do we have with the Chinese? Do we need cheap manufacturing? Like, well, I mean, honestly, we can go to other countries and we've started to a little bit, but we could just very easily bring that. It exposed the supply chain issues during COVID, exposed what one problem can really disrupt a global supply chain. We just bring the jobs home. We can put that investment here. It might be slightly more expensive, but we'll pay that price right now. We act like we need them, and that only fuels the exploitation cycle that the Chinese have of the United States. Where if we just simply said, like, we don't need you guys, we were fine before, we don't need you now, then the Chinese would come to the table, which, again, to Trump's credit, and I will give credit to the Biden administration as well for continuing it, they came to the table when Trump was like, yeah, this has been a one-way street, no more, or it's no longer going to be a one-way street. They came to the table and made concessions because they realized the leverage had gone out. Now, they also played the long game and understood that, well, we just have to wait a few political cycles and things will be back to normal. So for the US, we have to A, start acting like we don't need the Chinese. We don't. And then B, follow through with that long term, not just 4 years, 8 years in a political cycle. Like, we need to look at this decade by decade.
Yeah. Dude, so yeah, agree 100%. And this is a more J view of international relations on the whole. And that is have really good discussions with you, Colin, and other friends of mine about like what should the current US Taiwan policy be? And I feel like there's two schools of thought here. And the two schools of thought are one, one can be characterized by the traditional isolationist, like, why do we even care about a country that we agree is part of China, Taiwan? Uh, and like, if China were to launch an invasion today on Taiwan, what difference would it make if the U.S. Would go like, we don't care, we're not getting involved? Similar to how the U.S. approached the Ukraine, right? When Russia launched this like significant cultural or not cultural, conventional invasion of a European country, the US said like we're not getting militarily involved. Sure, we'll do economic aid, sure we'll do military equipment, both lethal and non-lethal. We'll do that aid, but we're not getting involved. What difference would it make if the US did the exact same thing to Taiwan? That's the more isolationist, hey, we're not going to get involved. The other school of thought is much more broad, much more idealistic in saying like, no, we absolutely should get involved on the principle of what's called the liberal democratic world order, right? It's this idea that liberal democracies should ensure the existence of other liberal democracies and even go so far as to try to spread, like intentionally and actively spread democracy globally, right? Whereas that first position, that isolationist position, would have been like, each country should decide for itself what kind of government it has. And that includes like, if you want to go be a communist, like go be a communist. You're not hurting me. You just go do your own thing. And that's kind of a unique American like position because we have two massive oceans, friendly neighbors, more or less.
Hmm.
And we have the luxury of being able to say that. I say all that to say that when it comes to how we should handle the Taiwanese approach, Jay, personally believe in the second position that the United States, for all of our faults, we are a global force for good, right?
Isn't that from the Navy's commercials?
Yeah, that's a Navy recruiting commercial, but that just popped in my head.
I just,
But it's true.
I knew I
Like,
had heard that.
it's a vision of like what does right look like in the world. So on Twitter, so two things. There was a senator, part of me wants to say it was Tom Cotton's, part of me wants to say it was like Jordan. It was a Republican senator gave this speech in some committee or on the Senate floor or something like that, and was talking about like it was kind of fear mongering. It was like, imagine Chinese Navy ships patrolling the Pacific coast or going to visit Hawaii. And on Twitter, this Chinese academic, sorry, he's an American academic, but he's Chinese, was commenting and was like, he was calling this Republican senator indirectly, he didn't say this, but he was calling this Republican senator a hypocrite and was basically saying like, do you not realize the ignorance of what you're saying, Republican senator? Like, we have the Seventh Fleet patrolling the east coast of China, like doing these freedom of navigation patrols in the Taiwan Strait. We have multiple military bases all over, like in Japan, in Okinawa, in the Philippines, which, by the way, fun fact, I've seen this floating around social media when it's like these images of the Western Pacific, Eastern China, and it's got like these American flags where there's allegedly bases. I've seen multiple different versions of this picture. They're almost all wrong. All of them have a US base in Hong Kong, which, folks, we do not. There's zero military bases in Hong Kong. And in Macau, we're not there. There's almost always a dot there. I don't know why. We are in Japan. We are in South Korea. We are on a weird basis with the Philippines right now. We're in Australia. Like there's lots of bases there. They're just not on mainland China. Anyway, my counter argument to this Chinese academic is there is no hypocrisy in saying that it is a good thing that there is a democratic country ensuring the freedom of other democratic countries in the Western Pacific, as opposed to saying the communist Chinese are patrolling the borders of other democratic countries. Like the CCP and the government of the United States are not morally equal. The communism is bad. Like, objectively, that is an objective moral statement that I'm sure is up for debate, but I believe that to be an objective moral statement that the Communist Chinese Party is an evil government institution on so many different levels. We've said it before, but like the
60
oppression
million
of the
people have died since since 1950. Like,
in ways that make Hitler look like a nice guy, right? Like, we can't forget that. So no, I don't feel like a hypocrite in saying that it's a bad thing if the People's Liberation Army Navy, that's what they call themselves, they're the Army/Navy, because their entire military is the PLA, and the PLA has a Navy, and the PLA, the People's Liberation Army, has an Air Force. Anyway, so yeah, it is a bad thing if the PLAN is patrolling the West Coast and Mexico and Canada and Alaska and Hawaii, whereas it's not a bad thing for the U.S. 7th Fleet, or for our British listeners, if the Queen Elizabeth, that glorious aircraft carrier, is patrolling in the Western Pacific, because we are liberal democracies. And I don't mean liberal in the, conservative versus liberal sense. I mean it in the like freedom, like what we stand for on a fundamental basis is that people should be free to choose their government. And right now, the people of China don't have that. And if they don't want that, that's fine. But right now, Taiwan does have that. And I believe we have a moral obligation to defend them. End of rant.
It was a good rant. I think that's a good way to basically tell our listeners that it's kind of up for you to decide. You can take everything we've just said and discussed, and I think it is something that you should think about on your own and decide what it is where you stand on U.S. and Chinese relations, because we've said it before, it is going to continue to be a major issue over the coming decades. Hopefully, it does not turn into a military conflict, but a lot of people, if you've seen the news lately, are making the argument that it is going to happen within the next 20 years or so.
Yeah.
Anyway,
nothing is inevitable, but it does appear that that's the trajectory that we are on currently.
Yeah. The Russians and the Chinese believe the next world war will be in 2035. But anyway, I digress. That's for you to decide. You can make your own assumptions, but you should have a historical context behind what is happening now, and that's the mission of the Loins of History. So we thank you all for listening. We did just get a 5-star review recently, so thank you, Jake38. Very, very short and to the point on the review, educational and entertaining. That's exactly what we want to do. So thank you for that, Jake38. Right,
thanks,
I like
Jake38.
a man of few but powerful words.
That's right. And accurate. Totally right. The best
100%,
words.
100%.
I know it. You know it. Everybody does it.
It only took three words to sum it all up. But
right.
Seriously, we do appreciate our listeners, our followers. If you want us to give you a shout out, give us a 5-star review. Help us get the word out. It helps the algorithm so we can generate a few more views and a few more clicks. If you want to follow Jay and I, we're somewhat active on social media, depending on how available we are in our free time. As families and work definitely take priority, as does the podcast itself. So we do post from time to time. If you'd like to follow us on basically any variation of the Loins of History on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. I think we're even on YouTube as well. Feel free to give us a follow and a review there. Give us any feedback that you have. We do keep up with messages and can talk about different topics or answer questions in the comments. And we want to thank you for listening to the Loins of History.